Hello and welcome. In this video I will be discussing Velma Barfield. This video is done in a similar style of my favorite true crime YouTuber Bailey Sarian, who talks about different true crime cases while she does her makeup. So today I decided to get my own take on it. Margie Velma Bullard, later known as Margie Velma Barfield, was born on October 29, 1932 in rural South Carolina. As a daughter of a farmer named Murphy Bullard and his wife Lily, Margie, who everyone called Velma, was the second of 9 kids that the Bullards had. Stories state that the Bullards were so poor that the house they lived in was an unpainted wood siding house that lacked all common amenities such as no running water, no electricity, and not even an outhouse. Being so poor, Velma was made fun of in her early school life because she did not come from a family that could afford new clothes and shoes for her. She, not wanting to be ridiculed, began stealing to pay for things to fit in until she was eventually caught by an elderly neighbor who later confronted her father. Stories state that when her father found out, he beat her mercilessly, causing her to never steal again. She resented her mother because she never stepped in to stop any of the beatings and would take favorites of the other siblings and continue to boss Velma around. Her father is seen today as a traditional figure. He had multiple children with his housemaker wife, and he ruled with an iron fist. The kids were born into the family to do work until they were old enough to leave. Such thing is exactly what happened to Velma. Early on in high school, she met a man named Thomas Buke, and at 17, Velma married Thomas and left house to move in with him. The future was bright for both of them. Thomas wanted Velma to be a homemaker and for her to stay home to prep meals and keep house. They later had 2 children, Kim and Ronnie, who Velma made it her life's work to make sure the children did not have the same home life that she did. She was always keeping the kids busy, and when they went off to school, she volunteered for every field trip and school event. Unfortunately, this dream life came to an end when Velma had to have an emergency hysterectomy. After the operation, she was left feeling less of a woman because she could no longer have any children. And on top of this, Velma became very depressed and started to have other medical issues like lower back pain. Around this time, Thomas started drinking heavily and eventually lost his job due to losing his license over a DUI. With all the household tension going on, Velma lost a lot of weight and even passed out from it. After seeing a doctor, she was prescribed Librium and Valium, and this would mark the start of her drug abuse. Velma started doctor shopping, so she would always have access to her drug supply. Things took a turn for the worse when the house mysteriously caught fire and Thomas died from smoke inhalation. Stories are conflicting on where everyone was and where the fire was located, but it is for certain that Velma and the children were not home at the time. There was only fire damage to the room that Thomas was in, so Velma and the children stayed in the home. After a few months after her loss, the house caught fire again, and she moved back in with her parents. Velma soon began dating a fellow widower, Jennings Barfield. Jennings had a laundry list of medical issues and lost his wife very close to when Velma lost Thomas, which brought the two closer together. They were soon married in a church, something that Velma had always wanted but had missed out on in her young marriage to Thomas. She then moved in with Jennings and his teenage daughter, but soon after issues began happening. Because of her drug abuse, Velma ended up in the hospital multiple times, each time telling Jennings that she would change. However, he believed the marriage was a mistake and divorce was the only option. But it would never make it to that because Jennings died from heart failure. The death made her dive deep into her drug abuse, medicating herself to the point where she wouldn't be able to leave her bed for days. She attempted to gain employment but couldn't hold a job because of her mood swings due to the medication. The manager, as sympathetic, had moved her to stock duty in the back of the department so she would no longer snap at customers. But in the end, she was not able to keep the job because she kept coming in late. Luckily, Velma had just moved back in with her parents as her house mysteriously caught fire again. Shortly after, her father died at the age of 61 from lung cancer, and on top of this, her son Ronnie had left for the army. Her mother continued to boss her around even at her adult age, making Velma resent her even more. Velma's life did not get any better. Ronnie soon told his mother about his love for his soon-to-be wife. Velma did not give her blessing as she believed that he would no longer want to be around her. However, he still proceeded with the wedding. Velma's then boyfriend was killed in a car accident, but Velma was not around, so she was ruled out as a suspect. She did, however, receive a life insurance check of $5,000. The bad news continued to come as she was arrested for forging prescriptions. She pled guilty and was able to get a suspended sentence and only had to pay a fine. Later in the summer of 1974, Lily, her mother, became very ill, complaining of painful cramps and throwing up with violent diarrhea. When she was taken to the hospital, the doctors could not figure out what was causing her ailment. And after a few days in the hospital, she seemed to have made a full recovery and went back home. Things seemed to be going fine until Christmas, when Lily pulled her son aside and asked about a letter she had received. She received a letter from a loan company explaining that her loan payment was overdue on her car and it would soon be possessed if it was not paid. This troubled Lily because she owned her car. However, her son told her it was probably a mistake. A couple days later, Lily again fell viciously ill, losing control of her body and throwing up blood. Instead of calling 911, Velma called her brother Oliver, who came over, who immediately called 911. Unfortunately, 2 hours later, Lily had died in the hospital. Soon after, in 1975, Velma again caught trouble with the law for writing bad checks. She was ultimately sentenced to 6 months in jail, but ended up only serving 3. Velma, enjoying her newfound freedom again, was playing good girl for a year while she was searching for a job. In 1976, she found new employment as a caretaker for 2 elderly folks, Montgomery and Dolly Edwards. Montgomery, who was 94, was bedridden with a long list of medical issues, including no sight, and both of his legs were amputated. He was incapable of feeding himself. Dolly, 84, was in better condition than her husband, even as a cancer survivor and having a colostomy. Velma quickly moved in with the Edwards and even started attending church. As typical of her past, the good times did not last very long for Velma, as she soon started to butt heads with Dolly. Dolly thought Velma was failing at her caretaking job, and Velma said Dolly was a demanding nitpicker. As the two continued to fight, they soon lost Montgomery in 1977. Interestingly, Velma still stayed with Dolly as her caretaker, even though they continued to nag at each other. On February 26, Dolly had her stepson come over and had admitted to him she believed she had the flu and vomiting and diarrhea had taken over her. When he came back the next day, he found her weak and pale, and immediately had her go to the hospital. Dolly was later released from the hospital that night and back in the care of Velma. She again felt violently ill and was sent back to the hospital that Tuesday and died later that evening. Velma, again without a job, found another elderly couple to take care of, John Henry Lee and wife Record, who were 80 and 76 respectively. Again, things started off good until Record began to get on Velma's nerves, as Record liked to talk and Velma did not like to listen. Velma also did not like how the couple would fight in front of her. Soon Record had found a check that confused her on where it came from because she knew she had not signed it. This also bothered John, as he soon involved the police, but the case had gone cold as they could not figure out who had signed the check. Like clockwork, on April 27th, John swiftly fell ill with vomiting and diarrhea. Velma called 911 and got him to the hospital. He was released on May 2nd as the doctors could not figure out what was plaguing his illness. John stayed sick throughout May, recovered for a few days, and then falling ill again. His daughters were actually happy that Velma was there, and they loved how attentive to their father she was. Unfortunately for John, things took a turn for the worse when once again he had to be rushed to the hospital and ultimately died on June 4th. In 1977, Velma met her final victim, Stuart Taylor, who was another widower and tobacco farmer. Velma, again, after gaining his trust, began writing fraudulent checks to fuel her drug addiction, which he soon caught on to. As he started to poke around into the mysterious checks being written, he fell ill much like the rest of her victims. Using the same tactic as her previous victims, she poisoned him on and off until he ultimately died in the hospital. Finally, doctors felt complexed, and they ordered an autopsy to be performed, where they later found lethal doses of arsenic. Velma was picked up by the police and charged with murder. She later confessed to killing her other victims, including her mother Lily, John Henry Lee, and Dolly Edwards, who she met Stuart Taylor through. Police exhumed Thomas's body as well, and they also found traces of arsenic, but Velma denied that she had killed him. The outcome of the case: after trying to plead insanity and being rejected, she confessed to only 4 of the murders and was sentenced to death. She would be the first woman to be executed after 1962 and the first woman to be executed by way of lethal injection. Her day of execution was November 2nd, 1984, 6 years after her final murder. Her last meal was cheese doodles and Coca-Cola. The importance of this case and why we should care. Velma's story is much like many other killers, one that was filled with abuse as a child and one where she turned to drugs in her later life. It's hard to tell whether her killings were due to feed in her drug habit or if she actually enjoyed killing her victims. The night before her execution, she wrote letters apologizing to the family members of her victims. Yet, during her trial, she applauded the prosecutor during his closing remarks. So it's hard to tell if she truly was remorseful for what she did. Velma shares the same pattern like many other killers, and it can be used to identify future killers by how their childhood and their adult life leads to what they do and killing other people.